Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, we thought what we're going to have is a freewheeling, lovely conversation on the theme of the exhibition, this entire exhibition, Back to Black, No on the Off Ramps. Hi, Michelle Murray. I'm seeing a lot of lovely people who I know. Wow. See, that's Back to Black right over there. And Sam Anderson, one of our lovely scholars from New York, is in the audience as well, and many other people. This is a conversation between two scholars who, and I have to tell you this, when I used to teach at Binghamton, State University of New York, and I had a number of young, really talented grad students. And one of them came to me one day after taking a number of courses and said, you know, I travel back and forth to Zimbabwe and I don't plan to live in the US, so I don't think I'm going to finish this PhD. And I said to her, well, why not just finish the coursework and then we can talk about it later. Dr. Keyshia. so this is my So this is my former student. So it's actually, we've never done anything where we have this kind of exchange from Professor and her student. I'm really happy and proud of her accomplishments, significantly, and that she actually did finish her PhD and has continued to do quite an amazing job. She's a super teacher as well, so if any of you had her at Florida Memorial, you should be honored to have that. And my philosophy for all my students was give yourself the space to be brilliant. And many of them have done that. Most of them have, in whatever fields they have entered. Okay, so back to Black. What we want to start off by saying, yeah? Ah, right. So you wanted to get another drink? Okay. We're gonna slow it down. Slow it down. Because Babaka is gonna need to translate for distinguished visiting artists from Mali, Abdoulaye, and Modipo Keita in the back, so that they can be part of the conversation. So I'll just do my opening and let Babaka translate what I said. I'm sure he's gonna add some of his own stuff that I didn't say. That's okay. And I just said one of my students is in the audience, Michelle Murray, who is an amazing dancer, dance teacher and artist here in Miami. Michelle, also very proud of her from FIU. Right, okay, so back to Black. First of all, the whole logic of Back to Black, I want to start off by saying is a reclamation. Essentially, the Black peoples, as they are defined now, did not need to define themselves as Black prior to transatlantic slavery, although there were communities and places where Blackness was identified and defined. So people were defined in terms of their ethnicity, their language, their culture, but Blackness was not associated with abjection or negativity. That's the first point we have to say right away. So the second point is that the logic then of Blackness being identified with negation, with all of the horribleness that one encounters, from the major scholars indicate that it comes in full. You would have trends in different places, but it comes in full with the Portuguese during the period when they were beginning transatlantic slavery, because they had to account for negating Black people's identity in a certain way in order to do that kind of major dehumanization that take place. So one, that Blackness was not identified with abjection. There were people who were Black. It was a color. There were different ranges. There were all sorts of relationships that had to do with Blackness and ethnicity and language and culture, but not negativity in the way that it ends up being assigned via the transatlantic slavery. With that coming in, then, we end up having the abjection, the logic of Negro, as the Portuguese would then call Black people in mass when they were not called that before, being the descriptor, but then identified with negativity. Okay. You okay for translating? Oh, continue, we'll tell. Okay. So that's the second point I want to make. So then, thirdly then, the languaging around Blackness ends up carrying all of that consistently for the next 3 or 4 centuries. We will then have struggles to emancipate and liberate ourselves, and the language being part of that in the succeeding centuries. keep in mind the emancipation movement, the movement to emancipate people from slavery took an entire century, and that's important to say. It took an entire century. In the British, it would be in the 1936, 38, because you have apprenticeship for 4 years before people were finally free. The French is 1848, sorry. The Spanish ends up being around 1888, and Brazil being the latest around that time as well. So you have a large sliding scale then of emancipation throughout the 19th century, which people struggled to get free from the violence. We have to say that it was violence. And keep in mind, it's not just physical violence, dismemberment, as Toni Morrison calls it, of bodies, of minds, of families, of separations, and all of those various things that happen. But then subsequently, the attempt then to reclaim that sense of who we are. That's what's taking place. So when you talk about Back to Black then, it's an attempt to go back to reclaim something that was taken away, that was constructed in terms of abjection. That's really important to understand. Now, all of the political movements then across the diaspora that attempted to do that would take different forms. If you think of Rastafari, according to Sylvia Wynter, the whole point of Rastafari was to move blackness away from abjection. So locks, this is all here. Enjoy it, reclaim it, too bad if you don't like it. Carnival in Trinidad and many other locations, people blacken up. Jab, jab, and all of those forms, they would blacken up and want to rub against you to rub off that black on you if they could. So you have a series of movements in which people were doing that. The black political movements then of the 60s, the civil rights movements, we were joking about that just a while ago, and subsequent movements would then be a form, not a political form of doing that. And it would extend across the world. Steve Biko, Black Consciousness, South Africa, because you have apartheid. So according to Ta-Nehisi Coates, the logic of whiteness has to also be challenged. And he always uses the frame, the people who call themselves white or people who think they are white. Whiteness is also a construct. So blackness is constructed as an opposition, as a challenge to that overwhelming whiteness, white supremacy, which is identified with viciousness. You don't have to look very far to see it now, do you? It's right. All the things that scholars have been saying, isn't this true, Sam, for the entire period, is so manifest. All the oppressions are linked. Environmental degradation, indigenous people being debased and erased, the economic exploitation of peoples around the world. What just happened in Palestine in terms of settler colonialism and taking over land of people who have been there consistently. Women's rights. All of the links, and Sylvia Wynter makes this point consistently, that all of the oppressions have to be seen as various forms then of challenges, various forms of ways in which we have to challenge a large process of oppression, and not to see then all of these movements as just individual pieces, and that's important to say. So Back to Black for us then has to be about reclaiming that blackness, which has been linked to abjection and negativity and negation, and populating it with a lot of the brilliance and beauty of black culture. And who does that best? The artists.
Yeah. And I think, too, there are all these intersections that are happening over those historical moments that are part of how we understand where the intersections even are right now. So in those earlier movements, it wasn't that you had a movement towards emancipation and to a reconfiguration of what blackness was during the emancipation processes that were happening in England, that were only happening for people who were in England, but there were conversations that were going on there that were happening in France, that were happening in Germany, that were happening on the continent simultaneously. During the Black Civil Rights Movement that we know of in the US, the majority of the people who were leading those movements were Caribbean nationals. And so there's been this fluidity, international kind of fluidity, around how we have defined and fought for and understood and constructed blackness. And somehow, some way, there was this moment where it seemed as though people needed to kind of own blackness in one place or another and kind of define it and say, well, it's only this, it's only here, it's only there. Not to look at where the intersections actually are and how what allowed us to survive and to thrive in every one of those earlier historical moments was our international solidarity. Our understanding that there is something about our origins and something about our cool, our style, our ways of being that transcended place, and that had more to do with soul memory and identity in a way that we see each other even now. We go places where we might go to a country that we don't think we know the language, but we have a way of speaking with our bodies to each other and understanding each other. There are ways that we can recognize style on each other and have that be a conversation amongst each other. And so when we think about what's happening around art and space and claiming these identities, and how it is that we're finding ourselves in this moment of reclaiming a sense of what Black is, I think there's something really important in understanding the power that we have had to own this space, to own what our creativity looks like, to own what our art looks like, and then also to consider how we own the spaces where our art is shown, how we own the spaces where our art gets a chance to really thrive, how we begin to cultivate a next generation that can do all of the work of promoting our work, promoting our work as artists, as educators, as intellectuals, etc.
Right. So it would be really great because Keyshia wrote one of the essays in the catalog. If you would just maybe see a little bit about what your argument was there.
Sure. So in that piece, it's looking at, it started from the sense of thinking about what's beyond the beach. So when people come to Miami, many of you will think about this, and I don't think it's something that we're conscious of, but the minute you become conscious of, you can't not be conscious of it anymore. And that is that in order to enter Miami, no matter what position you come to Miami from, you're passing over the neighborhoods that created the city. You're passing over the neighborhoods where we live. You're passing over the neighborhoods that created the very infrastructure that people are coming here to experience. And so that's both literal and figurative, right? So we know where we're sitting right now was one of the founding neighborhoods of the city of Miami. And when the decision was made to create I-95, this part of town was called Colored Town, and it didn't have the pejorative, to go back to what you were saying earlier, it didn't have the pejorative at that point. Colored Town was like, yeah, that's our town, we live there. And then it became, well, Colored Town, where the colors are, which started to get that other, the other kind of connotations to it. When the bridges that created the I-95 started to come over this neighborhood, in some ways there was a sense that it was over, right, over town. Like our cultural history, our cultural power was over. We know better. It wasn't that at all. It was actually going over town. And so linguistically, culturally, we hear this. Depending on where you're from, how you hear what we call this neighborhood, it depends on how you associate yourself with Miami. If you are from here, from this neighborhood, where are you? How do you say it? If you're from this neighborhood, those of you who know this neighborhood.
From here.
If you're from here, you're from over town, right? If you are from elsewhere, you may call this over town. That little thing is a big thing when you really think about it, because over town suggests this notion that you are now going over the town, which is where we are. If it's over town, then it's over town. It's, oh, well, this is Black people who live there. It's not a big deal, right? So linguistically, it has power. And so that was some of the framing of that. But then I started to think about this larger. So we have the sense that everything important in Miami happens on the beach. All of what is televised about Miami happens on the beach. And so if you're not from here, again, and you think you know Miami, it's because you've watched Crockett and Tubbs, you've watched Fast and Furious, you've watched Scarface, you've watched things that are not about how we live here. They're over there. And so we're always having to remind people, like, there's a thing of what is beyond the beach. So we have under the bridge, right, where we live here, under the bridge, under the bridge, beyond the beach, which is in addition to the beach, and then above the muck, because so many of the people who live and work here in Miami are the descendants of people who Zora Neale Hurston's talking about in Their Eyes Are Watching God, people who really worked the land, the Everglades land and the other land that really created the infrastructure.
Right.
So
One of the things we like about Hurston, and we have to also reclaim her. When I was teaching at FIU, I had students who had never heard of Zora Neale Hurston, who is probably one of the most foremost creative, intellectual contributors from the state of Florida, and actually provided language for a lot of what she calls what has become Florida tourist languaging of how one understands the state. But one of the things that Hurston does, if any of you have read her novel, Their Eyes Are Watching God, she has a character not go north at all, but actually go south. and it's a woman, and she has 3 relationships, marriages, so-called, and then, but she each leaves each one in order to find a certain fulfillment, but she goes further south each time. And that's a significant thing because during the time when she's writing this, the logic was that the North was the place of culture, creativity, and so on. And Hurston was very clever. She wrote a really interesting piece, which my class read last semester, which is called My Most Humiliating Jim Crow Experience. And where does my most humiliating Jim Crow experience take place? In New York.
In New York, yeah.
Right, because she goes to a doctor's office to have an examination and they take her into a linen closet rather than into the office where everybody was being seen and so on. So she's deliberate about claiming the South, about claiming Florida, about claiming all those erasures that you indicate that you see operating here. But what I wanted to do, talk a little bit more, and I'm sure we have such wonderful people in the audience who can add later on. What is blackness then? All kinds of different fields have entered this discussion to find ways to talk about blackness. Definitely blackness is a membership norm for many philosophers, and what they mean by that, and this is the link to no on or off ramps in a different way, that actually you can say you're not black or you cannot claim it, but something may claim it for you. And the biggest example for that is Tiger Woods recently, right? Because when he was picked up, I see somebody nodding, when he was picked up on the highway, he called himself Cablation, which is fine, right? But when he was picked up on the highway for driving while intoxicated and they showed his police report, guess what they put? Black. Okay, so there's a way then in which those identities that are constructed both by individuals who have a right, yes, including Meghan Markle, to claim biraciality. I have 2, how many grandchildren? 3 now, and they're all biracial or mixed race. We all biracial technically because the human race is full of a lot of complexities. We're actually multiracial. So I don't know if anybody is fully pure ever, because there are all sorts of migrations and movements which create people in different kinds of ways. So we can dispense, and that's back to that Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? The people who think they're white. So, so blackness is about claiming that identity, but it's also about the fact that the dominant dominant culture also names you in ways that they think are often linked to subjection. So how does one contest those 2 things? I think the meaning of that identity is in the middle somewhere in the interplay between those things, but the claiming of blackness as a particular identity has to do with a political stance as well. So we can say then it's a membership norm, as the philosophers would say, but it's also a political position. It's a way of claiming an identity, again, in resistance to a dominant culture which wants to erase you or put you in a negative kind of location or puts you in a place where you're not supposed to really have the space to be brilliant or do all the wonderful things you want to do. But it's also culture and style. And for many of us, we are told that there are no black people in certain locations, and then when you go there, suddenly there are black people in there. I went to India to a conference in 2006, sponsored by a group called the African Diaspora in Asia, and the people in India who were black were meeting each other for the first time. The cities they're called. We're not talking even about the Dalits who is a negative class. These are people who look like you, me, my aunt, my cousin. And when you see them, you want to reach out to speak, but they're not speaking to you because they're speaking Hindi. It's a different language.
And then similarly, when we were in Morocco many years ago, one of the most powerful experiences I think we all had in Morocco, we were there for the African Literature Association conference in the city. As soon as we arrived in Fez, there were some young men on a corner. I was coming up from Zimbabwe, so I should clarify this was another reason why it was so powerful an experience. I was coming up there from Zimbabwe, but meeting my colleagues who were coming over from the US. And we arrived at the hotel, and the first thing I heard was young black men across the street yelling at us, "Yo, niggas. Yo, niggas." And I'm looking around like, what is happening here? I don't understand, right? And it's everywhere in the world. And so it was this powerful moment, because here we are, all multiply hued black women, standing in front of this hotel for the African Literature Association conference in Africa, right, in Morocco. And for these young men, I realized this was not a moment to be offended. This was not a moment to like go across the street and have a conversation with them, like, a big intellectual conversation. It was more a moment of like, yeah, good to see y'all too, because for these brothers, it was more about recognizing, again, like what we see as powerful black style, they had seen black folks like us in the U.S. context on TV or wherever in videos, and for them they're like, yo, these some real niggas, you know? And so it was intense, right? And then a couple of days later, we went north to a kind of village. Remember, we went to like way north to the village. Yes, in the Atlas Mountains. And up, all the drive up, you know, we're seeing people working on land and working farms and stuff, and then we get there, and the minute we get out of the cab, there's a family, a woman with her babies, and she looked just like me, right? And she was just so excited to see us. It was a different kind of excitement. She brings her children over to us, we can hold the children, and she's touching us, and we're touching each other, and it was this moment of like, we are the same, but you are so different from me. But we're the same, but there's something I need my children to see about what's in you that makes you okay to be here too, yeah? Then I go to Turkey not too long after that. And I'm in Turkey with the Turkish Coalition for America. It was a sponsored program that brought together HBCU administrators and tribal college administrators, which was a really powerful thing to have together. And in Turkey, we found that two things. One, that there were words in the Turkish language that were the same in the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. They had the same meaning in Turkish and in the Menominee language. And secondly, that there was a humongous black community in Turkey, Afro-Turks, and who celebrate still festivals around yam and other things that we recognize coming from the continent. But similarly, seeing us and saying, hey, you know, there's something we can recognize in each other, and there's something that is transnational in our blackness.
Absolutely.
You know?
And one could say the same thing about going to Latin America and all those locations that people said there were no black people existing. Of course, there's a lot more research now, and people have traveled more and know where those communities are, and the scholars have found ways to find them. So if you go to Ecuador, you know, keep traveling. I started off by taking photographs when I see a black person, and eventually it's like everybody is black by the time you reach a certain location. And you can do this in Colombia. You could do this. Babacar and I were in Bogota, and we walked around a hotel, and there were black guys playing traditional instruments that one would find in Zimbabwe or Mali or the xylophones and stuff. And they were like so happy that we were standing there just listening to them. So one has that exploration. Of course, Brazil provides probably the most intense excitement around this question, because Brazil, particularly Bahia, and the people from Bahia, and the activists in particular, actually call it an African nation called Bahia. So that you do have then that whole question of a kind of reclamation. And in fact, we need to say that one of the most vibrant manifestations of a creative, intellectual, and performative movement that was called back to black was taking place in Brazil at the turn of the century. And I was quite fascinated about what they were doing there, because they have had a series of movements. In fact, one of the more interesting movements now has to do with women embracing wearing African head wraps and wearing natural hair and doing all of those wonderful things. So there's a series of times, I think historically, if we were to move it historically, then we said politically, creatively, geographically, and so on. If we were to move it historically as well, there's a series of moments in time when blackness reasserts itself. But why? Why is that? And there's a question I think that we will probably continue to talk about and raise. Sam probably have some ideas about that. The periods of time when blackness reasserts itself often has to do with times when we are most obviously oppressed in a very visible way, which is happening right now. Make no mistake, the US is now probably the most racist country in the world. We were talking about that a while ago. Where else? South Africa doesn't behave like this anymore. You may have problems, but no, right? You can't say Brazil. It's the US. And if the US has that kind of global international impact, which therefore influences countries around the world in terms of what it decides to do and so on, its public policy, in the way, for example, it treats other nations around the world, including today what the UN ambassador said about why the UN Security Council is standing against, always against Israel and so on. The whole question, I think, of where the US is positioned as the most racist country in the world, we have to say this, y'all, because otherwise we'll be really caught in a really bad place of not really recognizing a manifestation that we have to resist in really deliberate ways. So politically, again, it seems to me that blackness as a construct, as a concept, as a reassertion, comes back in context where we are facing really severe, oppressive state governmental practices, which then manifest themselves in public ways, as happened in Charlottesville, in Virginia, and so on.
Yeah, and I think in those contexts too, that's also where we're seeing both international solidarity, and we're also seeing a kind of, in some ways, a leveling of class, where ordinarily class may be the thing that separates us from each other. It's in those moments when blackness becomes really significant to us and necessary, even more necessary to us, that class starts to kind of fall away a little bit, and we're like, you know what, beyond economics, we need to find our power together. And I think, when you look at like South Africa, at Brazil also in another way, the movement there that has helped blackness grow is the Black consciousness movement that is actually, coming from the South African version of Black consciousness from Steve Biko, so that now there's an organization in Bahia called the Steve Biko Institute, which part of their responsibility is making sure that education, for example, is equitable for everyone. And so I think in every one of those circumstances, we were in Mexico City over the summer, looking at how education there is also shaped now around what does it mean for indigenous populations to have more power in education systems? Well, that means going back to traditional languages, going back to looking at who are the original people of this place and how does blackness itself manifest here. So while there are these moments of oppression, I see each of those opportunities for greater solidarity and for us to recognize what our power really is. I mean, I think also we see in every one of those situations more of a return also to African spiritual systems, ways that we kept ourselves whole through all of the awfulness. There's an understanding that there's been something that has allowed us to survive in each of these places. You see it in Jamaica, you see it in Trinidad, in Brazil, all over the Black world.
Right. One of the other things that, and Keyshia reminded me when she said how she was hailed in Morocco, but we were in Egypt, around the area near the pyramids, and instead of being called that, we were called Nubians, and the guys were like, "Hey, Nubians!" And I thought, oh, how cool that was. But then somebody told me in some cases it's pejorative, but I liked it. I'm like, Nubia is a nice thing to be called. But I think Nubia is how certain people in that part of the world define their people who are identified as blackness. But I think the language is really interesting, because keep in mind the language shifted consistently for Black people throughout history as they were claiming themselves. So you had the movement, first of all, being called, Black people call themselves African, first of all, and this is documented really well, and even the way the churches are called, African Methodist Church. The first poets like Phyllis Wheatley used Africa or Ethiopia as a self-definition and so on. So we have that whole languaging of people calling themselves that. And then you would have a series of slippages later on into colored. But all of these are racial categorizations, keep in mind, which were put in place to divide people up in multiple ways. In places like Puerto Rico, they have 250 categories to call Black people. Yeah. Yeah, all kinds of names. Like if you're Black and your hair is a little straight, then you are something. If you're Black and you have blue eyes or gray eyes, you're something else. So like all of these were anthropological categories that were created to divide and place Black people in categories. So all the, the Catholic Church. Right. So you have the languaging and all this referencing to being called colored and people being proud to be called mulatto, to be called, all of these are categories, fractions of quadroon, octoroon, and all kinds, and different places, as Philippe is indicating, and Brian too, would have different languaging of Black people in different fractions. So the question of fragmentation, right. The question of fragmentation of Blackness has been really significant all over the world, and this is one of the things we have to think about. So we have to look at the languaging, not be troubled by it, but to recognize what it is and to call it out and claim it if it's viable, if it's something that is useful. So then by the time you get colored in the United States and people locked into it and people still want to be called Negro and people still wanting to be called whatever, you can see why languaging around Blackness became really significant for a particular political period, a political movement that for some scholars, including the naming of African American, limits the whole definition primarily to the US state. I think this is Greg's argument, as opposed to black, which has a lot more global kind of referencing and so on. So keep in mind, languaging is really significant. I don't think it's, all of the current, I think the youth culture, which refers to themselves using the word N-word in certain kinds of ways is challenging, but it's not, to me, it's not the worst thing, although that's debatable, and some people may challenge that. But of course, there are different ways in which that languaging plays different roles in different locations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was curious about your thoughts about people who define themselves as transracial.
Yeah. So that's a heavy one. It's a really heavy one.
You're talking about racial, like racial dolezal and so on.
Yeah. So I think, I think it's an interesting space to be in where people think that that is a possibility. But then I want to go back to what Carol was saying earlier about the U.S. being the most racist country in the world. So when you come from the most racist country in the world, people are always seeking a way out of that. Let me find some way to not be part of that. Let me find some way to find something else to be. But anywhere you go, people are going to see your blackness. So you could try, and you could claim a term like that, but anywhere you go, you're going to be black, And it's a reality, So I think, black or African, there's some definition around that, some way that you're seen. I think that only happens when you think it's possible to erase yourself. And then you think about, what is the psychology that has to happen in your mind to believe that you need to be erased in the first place? There's something about who you are that needs to be smalled up, taken away, minimized, put in a box somewhere that says you're not what's beautiful, you're not what's powerful, you're not, what's leading things, you're not a change maker, you're not, that to me is much more problematic than the term itself.
Right. Well, I have a colleague at Cornell, Riley Snowden, who is transgender, and he is writing a book about, just published actually, about the whole trans logic, that we're in a kind of cultural space where all these transversalities, I think he calls it, appear in different kinds of ways. And yes, it is, I think, about that whole question of, finding a way outside of a particular racial category. But one has to always mediate that claim with the question of racial appropriation. How does one claiming that position one in relation to the rest of the population that are struggling in different kinds of ways? Otherwise, then people like Kim Kardashian claim she is that as well, so they can add extra booty and do their braids and so on, and then say they're black, but then they're not living black women's experience on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's a fair enough cultural, political term that one could talk about, but then what are the power implications inside of that claim, and how does it impact that relationship to other people around who are not really claiming that or not able ever to claim that identity. So I think, I think to complicate it would be really important to see what happens with it.
I work with young people a lot who are, I work with them to have international education experiences, to help them get out into the world in different ways and see themselves. And what I think, one of the reasons I love that work so much is what happens when you see yourself in a different context. Most of the young people I get to work with had never been anywhere before had never been even outside of their neighborhoods, maybe before they had a chance to go on one of these programs. And so now, you've grown up your entire life, maybe here in Overtown, and so your perception of your power is conditioned by the realities you live in this place. Now you go to England and you see the way that black is used as a totally different term in England, right? Black in England, you're talking about people who are from East India, people who are from Pakistan, people from, Arab, people who are black, have black in a sense of political solidarity. And then suddenly you become important in that space in a way that's different than the way you saw yourself where you came from. So suddenly, even if you might have been somebody struggling with this possibility of wanting to have a transracial perspective, suddenly you see yourself now amongst people who find something important in your power and want a piece of it. You're a young kid who grew up, in Liberty City, and you have a chance to go to China for the first time. You are a superstar. You land in China and you are the best thing in that moment in China. Right. Everybody wants to take a picture with you. Everybody wants to everything with you, and it's suddenly like, wait, trans what? Nah, I'm black, man.
All right. So should we ask for questions? Do you have any questions? We could keep going, but we'd love if you have any questions. Yeah, in the back.
One of the things that are unique to Miami and South Florida is this whole notion of blackness around where you come from. And
Yeah.
we haven't been able to
Right.
align that. I don't care if
Yeah.
you're Caribbean, I don't care where you came from, you are black. And somehow we seem to be still comfortable in South Florida with these divisions of what blackness is. How do we align our blackness so that we can move ourselves forward in South Florida?
That's a great point. Actually, I'm sad to say it's not just South Florida. Recently at Cornell, the Black Students United, they're called, had a series of demonstrations because of racism that had taken place in town. And, you know, frat boys in predominantly white universities, whenever they get drunk, they call somebody the N-word or whatever, right? So, and actually didn't just call the student that, they beat up this guy in downtown. So black students created a state of emergency and created a list of 12 or 10 demands. One of the demands was that the university enroll more African American students whose 2 generations or 3 were born in the United States. And well, there you go.
Well, yeah.
And I called, when I found out about it, because Keyshia Davenport, one of my former students who is at New School, sent it to me and said, we don't want this in New School because we have a lot of students from everywhere, and we hope that this doesn't really spread anywhere else. I called the BSU president and I asked her, what's going on? I had one of them in my class who was on the exec, and she said, well, this is the president's email. And she said they got it from a Harvard study, which was done in 2004, I think, which talked about the fact that the students who were getting to universities were predominantly Caribbean and African students. So they wanted more African American. Now, I told her there's a way to talk about that, because based on that definition of the 2 grand, first of all, it's patriarchal, but, right, and there's a slavery referencing going on there. This was used in the South to block people from voting, white and black. But also, people like Malcolm X and his children would not get in. So in other words, the boundaries about what is constituted as blackness is really problematized in a very dangerous way in a formation that limits that in that way. And in fact, they could make that same argument, but in a different way. They have to demand the university recruits from different locations and not just from one pool, and not just students who ace SATs as they sometimes do, and so on. Because a lot of times Caribbean students, if they come into SAT, they do really well because they've been trained in a certain way that they will get 1,600, whatever is the max, Rosemary, I don't know, right away. So there's a way that can be argued as opposed to framing it. The point that I'm making, it's not just specifically Florida. Florida may have a very acute formation because of the population here, but one finds versions of that in many different locations. It's problematic and it's easily challengeable, I think, because the way that racism works in the United States, once you drive down the street, I don't think the police stop to ask you which country you're coming from.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I would say, yeah.
Abla has a question. Yeah, and I think, let me just add one other point about that. I was teaching Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow a few semesters back, and the white students in the class, all of them would say that they never, I mean, it's maybe a question of willful ignorance, but they never knew that black people got stopped like that, because whenever they ran into police, they're also cordial. And they usually help them and stuff. So they were shocked that this is how black people are treated. And this is an important point to get, because they may be ignorantly expressing a certain kind of dominant reality, but they're capturing something that is really fundamental in terms of how blackness is positioned. Again, back in terms of abjection by the state, because these are the operators of the state, the officials of the state who are with power to detain and restrict you if you're black in a certain, if you're visibly black in a certain kind of way. If you're not,
Yeah.
I think at that point the transracial people may escape.
Right.
That question.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you want to add.
There's one other thing that I want to add to that, and it's something that I kind of allude to in the article that's in the catalog, is that people outside of the U.S., well, people in the U.S. aren't educated very much about U.S. Racial history, right? We're not educated well about that here, right? So then imagine how little education there is about that anywhere else, right? If we're not taught that here, And then people definitely aren't taught that in a really strong way elsewhere. And at the same time, we're not learning about other people's racial history, racialized histories. And so one of the bizarre conflicts that we're in, I think in South Florida, but and elsewhere too, we just see it very acutely here, is the campus I was working at before my current position is the only HBCU in South Florida. And so we have a lot of students. It is a historically black college. That doesn't mean you're all African American, right? That means you're black from all over. And so it would be very common that we would have students from maybe Jamaica or from Bahamas who would say, but I don't understand this whole stop and frisk thing. I don't get it. I don't understand why, if they get stopped here. If they get stopped, they would know. But it's this moment of this expectation that people have that every black person's experience once they set foot in the U.S. is the same already, without understanding the history behind it, right? So yes, there is a quick introduction and a quick lesson that happens, but I think there needs to be more understanding about what is possible when you come from a free place, right? What is different in your mind when you come from a place where your blackness is not the enemy of the state, when your blackness is actually your power, when it is you are in the power position. If you're coming from Jamaica, Trinidad, Bahamas, etc., you're in a powerful place. So we had this moment even when that fool was elected to run the country. There was this moment when parents from Bahamas wanted to stop sending their kids to this college here. Right. They were like, we're not sending our children up there. Look, what's happening, you know?
This is true.
And so this is a real thing because there's a sense of kind of black fear here. But we need to know each other and know our histories a little bit in order to really unpack that more together.
Right. They actually had a state advisory that they should warn young black men from the Bahamas that they could be killed if confronted by the police. So that was actually done.
Yeah.
I know Abdullah had a question. You're going to translate for him or comment?
Yeah.
Okay.
C'est pas une question.
You want to stand up so they can see you?
It's not a question. He's just asking the authorization to say just few words.
Yeah, absolutely.
C'est
Can you
juste-
stand so people can see you? Yes. Otherwise, they won't know who's speaking.
Okay.
Can you just
I will
stand?
stand me.
No, here.
Ok. Est-ce que tu pourrais te tenir debout, comme ça les gens pourront te voir.
Non, je voulais dire deux mots. Le premier, c'est remercier les organisateurs de cet événement de m'avoir invité et d'inviter Modibo avec moi. Le deuxième, c'est parler un peu de l'importance des arts et de la culture dans la société. C'est vrai qu'aujourd'hui, le développement scientifique, technique, technologique, le numérique, le virtuel, l'armée, l'économie, tout est important.
I would like to first thank the organizer of this project to have invited me from Mali to come here, and also invited my colleagues at the national television, Mr. Modibo Suarez, also to come with us. I wanted to just say that, of course, today the economics, the army, the science and technology, from the numerical to the virtual, all these are important, but
Mais je pense que tout ce que je viens de citer sont complémentaires.
I think that all what I have cited, mentioned earlier, I believe are just complementary to.
Mais pour moi, la culture, elle n'est pas complémentaire à ces choses-là, mais elle canalise tout ce monde de création que nous avons pour le développement.
But I am more and more questioning if all these science and technologies are complementary to culture, or if culture exists as a specific product that perhaps has to have a boundary in its relationship or in its articulation with these science and technology.
Et elle est pour moi l'arme fatale, l'arme la plus redoutable de la société.
Because for me, culture is the most powerful weapon of our society today.
Donc, aider dans la création, aider la culture, pour moi, c'est asseoir la société.
So for me, to organize culture, for me, is to redefine and create society.
Je ne peux que remercier l'organisation de cet événement, tous ceux qui financent la culture, tous ceux qui financent l'art, leur dire merci.
I can only thank the organizer of this project, all that have been part of the funding, all that have been part of the organization, to say that as far as people like you exist, we can go home with the artists and be confident that the purpose for which we are creating is understood by our people.
Nous formons, dans le secteur de la culture, nous disons que nous formons l'ADN des peuples.
We are, as artists, our creation are the DNA of the African diaspora. It's art. Black art is the DNA of the African diaspora.
Merci pour l'invitation et merci pour l'événement.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the events.
Because some of the audience may not know. I'm asking Babacar to just say a couple sentences about who Abdullah is.
Okay. So Konate is he's coming, both who he is and why he's here. I have mentioned that earlier in my presentation. But again, for those that came late, so I will, those who were not here, Ablai Konate. Ablai Konate is an artist from Mali whom I have defined earlier in my own thinking as the most important today contemporary artist living on the continent of Africa. Wow. Both because of his artistic articulations, his research, his teaching, but at the same time, his relationship with gender at the time where in the United States, we are now in the going back to that which women have the control, that is tie-dyeing. The knowledge, the science, the techniques, to what degrees a granary should be boiled, for Ablai to provide that space to prepare the canvas, to prepare the dye from a white sheet, then to go into the bush to get the barks, which barks gives you that red, how much you should mix it to get that brown. This is a knowledge that is controlled, that is in the hands of les teinturiers. And Ablai is giving them space to link that science and technology into these traditional, to now, after they've done that, to base his visual discourse on the production of these women. That is why I say he's the most important contemporary artist in Africa today as we speak.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Abdullah. And if you haven't seen his work, the big, huge, amazingly impressive tapestries, you would call them, using fabric and using different forms of art across the room. We thank you, and it's a pleasure meeting you. Yes. And his work is on the subway cars in Morocco. If you Google it, you will see on the sides of the subway cars, as it passes by, you can see those big tapestries. He had an image of it, which is a nice way. Those of you, if Neil is still here, the architects like John West and others who are here, that's something they can propose, that they put artists' works. I mean, the graffiti artists have been doing it here anyway. But I mean, to put other artists' works as well on
When I was introducing the artists, again, if you go to the downstairs, you will see an installation of photography and acrylic and then plexi acrylic. Yes. That is perhaps very important this year in Art Basel. And sometimes the story is not always told in the mainstream. But it seems to me that this is one of the most contemporary articulation of the issues that we are talking about, and the ways in which both the panels kind of gives you, like taking you into a journey of these issues that we are dealing with in Back to Black. And I was so pleased when I had him at my house during the interview with the artist, and he said, I'm going to do something I cannot tell you, but go ahead. I will do the work. And I'm very pleased that when the work came, it is what it is today. I'm talking about Sadi Khali. Sadi, stand up, man. All right. He was not here when I introduced the artist. Miles I introduced Miles. He was not here. Many black women in the show. Lyric Prince from Washington D.C. We have Aisha Bell. We have a wonderful graduate from FIU, Rhea Leonard's work on a black woman's body and the ways in which she constructs black woman's body as a site of violence, but also as a site of resistance, talking back. So we are very, very comfortable with not only what is coming out of Miami within the black artists, but also how now Art Africa is able to kind of cross the boundaries and re-engage in this old formulation we call black transnationalism. I was explaining to the director of program of the National Television of Mali that we have, prior to us establishing this relationship, there was another relationship of George Padmore with Chemoko Grand Koyate, another expression in the 1940s of this black transnationalism we are trying. So today, if you go to Ghana, the National Library of Ghana is named after George Padmore. If you look at, for example, in Mali, we were talking about it, what will have happened if Modibo Keita was still president? Will we have jihadists that are crossing, just bringing terror and destruction in Mali, only because that is one of the site of the civilization of African people in West Africa. So we cannot allow these jihadists to win.
Thank you, Babacar. I think Peter Wayne Lewis and then Brian had questions. Peter Wayne Lewis, another art, and you did again. Oh, Peter Wayne Lewis had a question. Peter Wayne Lewis, artist from Jamaica, but global citizen also from New Jersey, Beijing, Massachusetts, and California.
Comment to our esteemed guest from Africa, the homeland. I think he really tapped into like a key word when he said DNA. And the whole idea of what culture actually is. All the artists that's actually here, we are cultural producers. Culture does not exist in a building. It's in our body, it's in our bones, it's in our blood. It's how the synapses of our brains actually connect things. So for our guest to bring his body into like this space, that's culture. And it is pertinent, it's alive, and it's alive. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Peter.
Sure.
Brian McFarlane, also artist from Jamaica. His work is downstairs. Peter's work is across in the Pan-African Pavilion, I believe.
Yeah, from the standpoint of physical anthropology, looking at black people's body, how they are treated there. You have Kim Kardashian, for example, might put on a little extra business as a way, or gluteus maximus, what do you call it, ass, in order to make a physical appearance to look.
He wants to have you
And then on the contrary, in the poorer communities where wealth is concerned, you have those who are cleansing the color of their skin, bleaching now. You have women who are doing that a lot, and you have even men who are doing it. On the contrary, you have these millionaires who are kind of, kind of planting aspects of their body to look more physically like the stereotypic aspect of black people. How would you, what is happening in that? Because is the person cleansing their face, is this a form of reclamation of ancestral spirit? What are they reclaiming? And putting on more business on your body, on the bunda or on the ass or whatever. What is happening? All right.
Can pass that? Yeah, but well, on the butt, the big buttocks has become really a ridiculous appropriation for black women. I was looking at Spike Lee. She's got to have it. And one of the characters, there was a big joke, I guess, in a way, in that scene. Who? Yeah, it's awful. Yeah. Yeah, I know, you can add after that. Because in a way, the She's Gotta Have It initial film, which I wrote a review about, didn't really go to that extreme. But this has become a caricature. But there are women who are doing that. So it's black people as well who are, I think there are these figurative representations of blackness in a certain kind of ludicrousness to the extreme, which both white and black women seem to want to appropriate at times. But there's a lot of appropriation going in both ways. So whenever people complain, I tell people, I say this jokingly too, like, but look at all the black women who cannot wait to get blonde wigs, and that's the way they want to look in terms of representation, from Beyonce. It doesn't look like that normally, to Wendy Williams, or whoever, all of them. So there's a sense then in which appropriating the sort of so-called white aesthetic of what white people consider beautiful is also part of that frame. Now the problem with the bleaching is global, because you find it in Africa, you see the Venus de Milo, India, right, everywhere. So, and even reggae artists did it. We saw the famous athlete bleach himself to the ridiculous. So there's the question back to that sort of sense in which blackness is an abjection, but at the same time it's desire. So it's that clash between desire and abjection, I think, which is also taking place. And yes, it's in tanning. The current president doesn't look like that. That orange is a spray. It is. And when you look at around his eyes, that's how he really looks. Yeah. So he's not even satisfied with how he looks as well in terms of color. He thinks he needs to enhance his appearance and brighten it up a little bit. I think they're a little bit too much on the orange, but they could make it a little bit more milder. But it's a problem of black representation, I think, that is still there on both sides. And I don't want to let black women off the hook with that one at all. Yeah. We are part of it, because we also. But keep in mind the question what I was about to say first, and then I went, was the question of the dissection of black women's behind. If you look at that film of the so-called Venus Hottentot, Saji Bartman, you will see that was part of the Western. First of all, she was displayed right in a zoo-like situation for years in England. Then she got sick and ill. Then they dissected her buttocks, kept it in a jar, her genitals, kept it in a jar. And she only went back to South Africa after Nelson Mandela's presidency, when she was reburied. You can actually get this film if you haven't seen it. You know, the Return of the Venus Hottentot to South Africa. There are two versions of it by a South African filmmaker. So the representation of black women's bodies and the booty has a long history. On the one hand, you know, an aspect of black culture, and if you look at African women dance, they shake their butts, they do all kinds of things in terms of gymnastically doing one cheek, the other cheek. I mean, there's a lot of play with the musculature of black women's bodies. But the question of making it now into spectacle, making it now into something ludicrous, making it now into display, making it now into extreme representation, I think is a problem. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Similarly, so I was thinking about that, definitely that horrible She's Gotta Have It thing. The whole thing, the buttock split in particular. When I watched it at first, I was just so horrified by it because of the caricature and the injections and all of that. And I thought, wow, this is such an extreme, But then at the same time, I was thought about the Hot Not Venus at that time and thinking about there's a play that Susan Lauren Parks has also written about Saartjie Baartman and the Venus Hot Not. And I think about how you have these ways in which that's usually seen like through the male gaze, like that Saartjie's body that was done to her body because of the white male gaze. But then those weren't the people that the girl in the She's Got a Habit is trying to attract. She's trying to attract black men, and somehow thinks in her mind that if she injects her own natural black body with some strange substance, some silicone or something, that's going to be attractive in some way. And then, of course, it makes me think about body sizes and shapes that I'm seeing in Latin America. And that, like, the desired body shape is the one with the large backside. And this is the moment when Africanity enters into a discourse which is usually trying to whiten itself, right? Like, so ordinarily, the people are saying, no, I'm not black, I'm not this, I'm not that. But when it comes to the backside, oh, no, but I got this. My grandmama gave me that. And so there are all these levels of hypocrisy and mimicry and characterization going on. And then, when you think about like the gymnastics that people go through with their bodies, in Japan, the dance hall queens, the most powerful dance hall queens have been Japanese women who have learned how to manipulate the backside in a way that they think is Caribbean driven and African driven. And it's like, but where is the self in all of this? Where is the sense of kind of actually a genuine love of self, a genuine love of just what you have and how you are? The bleachings are something that we're really seeing all over the world, like literally all over the world. There are parts of Trinidad that you go to out in, like, more in the country, in Cuba and these places, where on the corners you can buy bleaching cream. There are whole stores that sell nothing but bleaching creams that are coming from India. There's a market that I went to years and years ago in Zambia. I was looking for bread, just bread. I couldn't find any bread, but I could find any kind of bleaching cream for any part of the body in Zambia, right? And this was a good 15 years ago. So the thought of, people on the continent bleaching their skin at that time, I just had no way to make that make sense. But now, with all of these different ways in which everybody has access to some form of self-mutilation, everybody, and it doesn't seem to be something that is specific to a racial identity.
Yes, and where exactly is this coming from? This answer. Where is all of this? Where exactly is it coming from? Other than just put it that it's not self-love. Where exactly?
The dominant media representations repeat it every single day.
Yeah,
and this is why the
everywhere.
artists end up being really so significant, because you all counter that, you challenge that, you
right.
push back. We were looking at, when I walked into prison the other day, and the first thing you see is a photograph of artists of two characters, totally black and charcoal on the ground. And Babacar always talks about his mother would sit in the sun and put shea butter all over her body and just before a festival, just so she could get blacker. So just think about that. So, the question of running away from blackness and its representation again as positive returns esteem in a negative way. And the media, we have to say it's the media, because almost every single time they have a chance to show one of the famous performers or entertainers, they actually lighten them up, including the white ones, including white women. They end up lightening them a little bit more. I think you had a question, and then we'll go to Silly. Yes.
Yeah, this is a question that I have personally been struggling with, and I'm curious to get your insights. Why, as Black Americans, should we stay in the most racist country in the world?
Yes, especially given your introduction, right? So yeah, I'll take it to the personal place too. I never thought I would live here. I never thought I would stay here. I never thought I would be back. When I moved to Zimbabwe, I was certain I was staying there forever. And I would come back and forth as I had to for graduate school, once we decided I was going to continue. But what... But part of what happened, I think, was a realization, one, that it's not perfect anywhere. Two, that no matter where I went, I was still bringing this place with me everywhere. Right? I was bringing this place, I was bringing my ancestry, my heritage, and all of that with me everywhere. And what I started to realize was that there was something important and good in that. I didn't think it was good before. I thought, there's a way that I could just leave being a Black American in a bag. I could learn Shona. I'm African? No. As much as in my soul and my heart and in my mentality and my way of seeing style and all of that, absolutely, I claim myself as a daughter of the African diaspora, as a person who has fluidity to go anywhere. But the reality is, there's a question that's asked anywhere that you are on the continent, in any language, any language, where are you from? And that question is different than what we mean by that here. In Shona, the question is Munova Kupi, which really means where is your ancestry from? And somebody asks you that, and you're supposed to be able to explain where is your father's 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 and where was your mother's 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 mother from? Because when you can say that place, I know who you are. Yeah?
No,
7 generations. Yeah, you need to go back. And if you don't have that, then your whole sense of who you are in the world is something to start to reimagine and to renavigate. So between Carol and a professor that I had from undergrad, who was really upset she was upset. You were really supportive. She was upset when I came back to Spelman to visit, and I told her that I'd been living in Zimbabwe and I wasn't really coming back. I was just visiting. And she was like, how dare you? We gave you all of this stuff. We gave you all of this knowledge. We gave you all this education. They didn't give me anything, first of all. But, first of all, it was a lot of work. But, she was saying, like, we didn't do all of this work for you to just go out there. And yeah, you owe somebody something back here. And, between those two things, it really weighed on me a lot. And I said, okay, there is something important about the coming and the going. And there's something important about being able to stand still and recognize what my parents, our grandparents, the 7 generations that we might have had here, there's something important to recognize in what they gave this place too. And if I leave and I never come back and I do nothing here, then I'm dishonoring them. I'm dishonoring their survival in this place. I'm dishonoring all of those who have made it possible for us to sit in this room right now. And so there has to be this kind of ability to be fluid about it. And I think, we do have a responsibility when we have agency and we have knowledge and we have blue passports, for goodness sakes. Blue passports that mean you can literally pick up and go just about anywhere in the world. Yeah, you apply for a visa, sometimes it's a little expensive, but the value of it on the other end is something that we can manage. I think we have a responsibility to see each other, to learn each other, and to continue to have those conversations with each other about art, about culture, to carry our DNA back and forth, and to have those interactions. Because I love when there's an opportunity to go to a place like Zambia, and stand there on the corner with the person selling the skin bleaching creams and have a conversation about the why. I love being able to be in India and seeing only these crazy billboards that have whitened out Indians, and be able to have conversations with little brown children, little Black girls. Hug them and hug them up and talk about like what's beautiful in them in a way that there's not somebody doing for them in their own village.
Right. But since it's a question you ask about something you're struggling with personally as well, I want to also add that there are people who have actually left and living quite happily in many different locations around the world. And that's a particular choice that they make. I like Peter Wayne Lewis's framing of himself as a global citizen, though, which is closest to what Keyshia is saying, because that gives you an ability to not see yourself as captured by the United States. If even you live here, it's not that you then have this as the only frame of reference. I think that's probably a better way. Because often for African Americans who've gone back to the continent or gone to other locations, they carry with them sometimes some of the negativities that took place here. So like Liberia, for example, where they instituted a whole class of people who existed in relation to the people who were indigenously there in a kind of hierarchy. But I've been to Shashamane. Has anybody been to Shashamane? You have to go there, please. That's where the Rastas from 1978, Haile Selassie gave them land in a place called Oromo outside of Addis, about an hour and a half from Addis. And they have a whole community there. They have a school for 400 children. And when you walk into the compound, if you inhale deeply, you will leave feeling really good. But they told me, that the elders who were there told me to tell y'all that Babylon is going to fall. So I keep saying that whenever I mention them, because they say, tell them Babylon going to fall. So guys, you're going to be the last.
Well, the conversation shifted just a bit from the bodies, but you spoke of being captured. And I think that's the reason. the answer is that we have been captured, and what we are seeing is someone else's control of our bodies and our wranglings trying to figure out who we are, where we fit, how can we escape, what do we need to get a hold of our bodies again. And I think one of the most basic forms of resistance is just being your beautiful black self. Yeah. Yeah.
Sam, my elder, you want to say anything? Okay, thank you. All right, Rosemary, you no? Right, okay. And my friend Dr. Phyllis Baker just came in. Yes.
One of the reasons why many of us choose to stay in the United States is that we are here to fight the system, to destroy it. If a critical mass of us leave, then the Trumpites of the world get to be more emboldened, get more organized, and their impact is global.
Absolutely.
So no matter where we are, the U.S. is there.
Exactly.
You know, so for me,
That's the critical
I'm
point.
here.
That's the critical point. Yeah, because somebody was talking about that today on NPR, that it's really not just here. We have to see it as a global issue because the U.S. now has that kind of impact. I mean, it had it before, but now it's even more visible. You know what I mean? So that the global impact. But I think we have to feel free to go other locations, and embrace them, and not go as tourists, just sort of to take, but also to give, and not to go with a level of oppression, but to go in a sense of engaging that space and learning from the people in those locations. I think that's what I've done each place. Yeah?
I like the gentleman said, I believe we have an important role here as, for making change, since the U.S. is so important, in the global economy. Now, but what I still don't leave clear on from the presentation, which I have enjoyed immensely, but I'd like to be very clear on things academically. As far as leaving, I leave with blackness. On government forms and things like that, it's B. But from the aspect of who you are, where you're from, I leave with Black American, like I believe other people might leave with being Black Trinidadian or what have you. Am I clear on that pretty much?
Absolutely. I think that's kind of the point I was making about what hit me after so many years of living in Africa is that I was doing a disservice to my ancestry by not claiming that. I never saw myself as an American until I went to live in Italy. I was 16 living in Italy, and nobody had ever seen, in the village I lived in, no one had ever seen a black person before, at all. I'm old. It was a long time ago. Put that out. This was not a couple of years ago. But nobody in that village had ever seen a black person before, and certainly never a black
Tell my
American.
students don't do that because they leave me little space when they claim their own.
I'm sorry. Okay, it wasn't that long ago. But so this was a thing that I never had wrapped my mind around before, like being seen as an American and what that might look like. But then I realized the power in it. If we don't claim that identity, then just as Sam was saying, everybody else gets to claim that. And what is American gets to look like that guy in the White House. What is American gets to look like his people. What is American doesn't look like us in this room. And if we don't claim some piece in that, then we are losing something really important. We're giving our power away.
Absolutely. And there was a nice point that you made that I didn't really answer, and that is, I think going forward has to be that we accept who we are in all of these forms, but we also accept other people's spaces and their rights to also go forward in their way without prejudice and without negativity, but finding a way to collaborate where necessary. To me, that has to be it. Otherwise, you end up with another hierarchy again about who is better and who. And I think Caribbeans have to also be very careful about how they understand the United States. A lot of times Caribbeans think that what they're seeing now is like the and it's like the reality without realizing how much struggle it took. Generations died to be able to get you to have a job, to be able to enter certain restaurants, to be able to do whatever. It's like students now, you know, young women students think that whatever they do now in terms of going to school is a given, when all of those things were fought by other generations of women so that they can get a bank account. There was a time when women couldn't open their own bank account. Do you all know that? They had to get a man or their husband to sign off on it, or their son. So many of these are gains that were made over the years. And so African Americans coming, and I've written about this in a book called Caribbean Spaces. Afro-Caribbeans coming into the US have to be very careful about how they enter and what benefits they gain from struggles that have taken place, not just by African Americans only, because keep in mind, you had Garvey, you had Padmore, you had all these people also. People were struggling collaboratively all along. So it has always been a joint struggle, and we have to embrace that. I want to say that to you because I know you had asked that question. Did you have a person?
Another category of Trinidadians that were born here in America, because that equals another subculture. But I was just thinking, okay, so is that Black, American, Trinidadian? You know, it gets very complicated.
Afro-Trinidad.
But this thing is interesting because it's a pre-introduction to who you are in case you don't get to read.
Absolutely,
everything about
absolutely,
her.
absolutely.
Right. You know,
Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind, there were a lot of migrations back and forth as well. People didn't really stay only in one place. So that's really important. The research shows that people came back and forth. In other words, when they brought Africans onto the Caribbean, from slavery, often they came to the Caribbean first, and then they came north. And then there was also going backwards, south. And then people ran away to the Caribbean. The Underground Railroad, as I said in that book, didn't really just go north, it also went south. It went to the Bahamas, it went to Cuba, it went to all those locations. So keep in mind the migrations were also consistently throughout slavery. And slave masters would also bring their slaves sometimes, the enslaved people, to work in other plantations in the United States. And there's documentation of that coming all the way to Massachusetts, South Carolina, North Carolina, especially after the Haitian Revolution, when they were running away.
Nova Scotia.
Right,
as well. Yeah.
right. There was a guy in the back. I hate to not have you on, because I was told we over, but I want to have you say. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for everything that's presented here. We really love being here and enjoying this with our family. And the issue of blackness, I totally love and enjoy what you're saying about the culture and how we embrace it. What I would add is that there's a book called The Art of War. Well, I've been speaking on the art of law, because a lot of the wars are taking place in the legalities, in the books, and the laws and the terms that we use. And under that guise, I studied the Christian black codes of 1712, or Code de Noir, as they were applied in the Louisiana Purchase and all of that, and how a lot of these black codes were put on us. When you mentioned the 250 different categories in Puerto Rico, a lot of that comes from that. So I just want to add that in the context that amongst us, we may say, I love being black and I love your skin and everything, we're wonderful. However, when you put things in law, on a contract, that's a whole nother different thing. Because I study the Moorish history and the Moor ruins of Jamaica, and where the Moors brought into Spain in 711 and all that.
Absolutely. 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 You're right. He's right. Yeah. And the people who work in law, like Rosemary, do a lot of good work in that area, because, yes, a lot of things are codified in law, and then we end up having to respond to them. Rosemary? Yeah.
Well, one thing I tell my students is race rules the law. And that's how we start our classes.
Okay. That's what you wanted to say. Okay. Thank you all for being so attentive. Thank you, Dr. April.
Thank you, Dr.
This is the first time we've done this. We should do this again.
We should.